Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about with GDP are what we call the limitations of GDP. So I believe we'll call this number 5. Say limitations of GDP. And what we mean when we talk about limitations is these are factors that make the statistic less accurate. Say factors that make GDP statistic less accurate. And there are a list of about 4 of these limitations of GDP. So the first one that we see fairly common, is what we call household production. And household production is not the production of houses, but it's the production that takes place within a house that is productive, but yet we don't have a way of measuring it in the GDP. So examples of household production would be someone mowing their lawn, someone that is cleaning their own house. And when this stuff happens, it causes the GDP to be understated. So we'll say here GDP GDP is understated. When these things are happening. And what that means, when we say that the GDP is understated, is that there's actually more production taking place in the economy than what our GDP statistic is showing us. The issue is that we don't have a way to account for all of those things that individuals do within their house that are actually productive. Okay? Now just remember that in order for these for household production to be a limitation, they have to be things that individuals are doing at their own house. If you hire a business to come in and mow your lawn, or a cleaning person to come in and clean your house, then those things will be counted in the GDP. And so this is only a limitation when people are doing this on their own. Second limitation is what we call non-market transactions. Non-market transactions. So these are transactions that take place, but we don't have a method to account for them and then add them in the GDP. Okay, so we'll say transactions that are not accounted for. And some examples of transactions that would fall into this category would be when someone hires a babysitter. So we'll say babysitter. Or if I would hire maybe the neighbor to come over and mow my lawn, and I pay him cash, he's not operating a business. And so the cash that I pay him is going to be a transaction, but it's not a transaction that's going to be recorded. So we'll say neighbor mows lawn. And so the difference between household production and non-market transactions is when there's household production, there's really no transaction that takes place. It's just production that's taking place around someone's house. Where non-market transactions, we actually have a transaction, but we haven't hired an actual business to come in. We're paying cash to someone to babysit or mow our lawn or wash our car or shovel our driveway. And so we don't have a way for those things to actually show up in the GDP. And so again, when these non-market transactions are taking place, we would say that the GDP is going to be understated. And the key to understanding what we mean when we say the GDP is understated is we're basically saying that the GDP statistic is going to be smaller than what it should be. If we had a way to account for household production, and if we had a way to account for non-market transactions, then the GDP value would be greater than what it actually is. Okay? All right, now we have two more limitations. The third limitation is going to be illegal transactions. So these are obviously transactions on things like guns or illegal weapons or drugs, or there's even an illegal market out there for selling body parts. So whenever there's a transaction that takes place that involves an illegal good, typically that's going to involve cash, and we don't have a method for tracking those transactions and for accounting for them and putting them in the GDP. So every time there's illegal transactions that are taking place, those things will not be counted in the GDP, and therefore the GDP again will be understated because the statistic is lower or less than the production that's actually taking place. So we can add here that the GDP is understated. And our last limitation is impact to the environment. Impact to the environment. And so what we have to know is that GDP is measuring our production, okay? And the more production that's taking place, the greater the GDP statistic is going to read. But what we don't account for is that oftentimes an increase in production means that we are negatively impacting our environment. But there's no way to account for that negative impact to the environment that happens with production. And so what we should know is this, when we're negatively impacting the environment, okay, we're not subtracting that from the GDP. And so this action of production leading to destroying the environment actually causes the GDP to overstate what's actually happening in our economy. So we'll say GDP is overstated. And that means that we're only counting production. We're not counting any negative impact that could be happening to our environment. So again, all four of these things are factors that cause our GDP statistic to be less accurate because all four of them are not going to be counted in the GDP. Okay?